And now we begin the nervous system. We have looked at muscles and bones, and now we're moving on to the nervous system. And in this video, and for this next coming test, we're going to focus primarily on some nervous physiology. We'll get into the central nervous system, spinal cord, and the brain in our next tests and our next video series. So here we're going to look at the major functions and divisions of the nervous system, types of cells we find here, major parts of a neuron, and then what is myelination. So when we talk about some basic organization of the nervous system, there's two basic divisions that we talk about a lot. We talk about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system and peripheral nervous system are integrated and they're connected, but they have different responsibilities, and we'll look more at the organization of it here in a second. But what you see in terms of major structures, identifiable structures, of course, the brain, spinal nerves, which are nerves that directly arise from the brain itself, the spinal cord, peripheral nerves, which are the nerves that come off of the spinal cord and go to the spinal cord, and ganglia, which are collections of nerve cell bodies that are outside of the CNS. And we'll get to that more in just a second. I want to show you this before we leave it, though. You do see we have sensory and motor here, referring to the directionality of the nerve signal. So we can send nerve signals to the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, or we can send it from it. So the term we use for that is sensory or afferent. Afferent. Okay, and motor, that is to direct the movement of something, is going to be efferent. So you'll see those terms again and again. So let's look at, on the next slide here, some basic organization of the central nervous system. When we are describing the central nervous system and we're trying to talk about its functional parts, what are the divisions that we talk about? We talk about first the central nervous system and its main responsibility, which is to process and interpret information. It's going to send information, send orders to glands, to muscles. It's going to direct their movement. But the term that you typically hear with the central nervous system is the brain is kind of this computer. It's processing all the information. There is something to that, because the brain has to make sense of the information coming to it, and as we'll talk about when we get into concussions and certain kinds of brain disorders, if the information doesn't reach the brain, you really can't make sense of it, and vice versa. If the information doesn't reach the brain at all, and then the brain has nothing to work with, then you really can't direct the same kinds of movements and responses that you'd expect from the CNS. The peripheral nervous system is the go-between. It's transferring information to and from the CNS. It transfers information from your fingertips, for example, when you touch something, to your brain. And then if you decide to move a finger, information comes back via a different nerve signal back to make your fingers move. But we can go further than that. The central nervous system, again, we can divide into the brain and the spinal cord, and you see the spinal cord is listed as the bridge between the brain and the peripheral nerves. We can divide the peripheral nervous system, though, up some more into a somatic nervous system, that is the voluntary nervous system, that which you have control over, and the autonomic nervous system, that which you do not have control over. You would think that sounds strange, because you would think that you would have control over everything, but you don't consciously control your glands, your blood vessels, the working of your intestines. You don't consciously control those. So those are going to be autonomic, that is sort of outside of your voluntary control. And within the autonomic, there is a sympathetic and a parasympathetic branch. The sympathetic is going to focus more on flight or fight responses. It's going to focus on how does your body mobilize energy, how do you get ready for an emergency, where parasympathetic is sort of a housekeeping system. It conserves, it gathers energy, it processes, and we'll talk more about those divisions as we get further into the nervous system. This system does have several kinds of cells, and we're just going to focus on the two general types with a little bit of an example here. And you see both types represented here, neurons and neuroglial cells. Neurons are the cells that actually do carry nervous signal information. They are transmitting the information to and from the central nervous system or within the central nervous system. Neuroglial cells are going to be cells that are supporting cells. The term glia means glue, and for a long time we thought that these neuroglial cells were just kind of supporting the nerve cells, just kind of holding them in place. Now we know neuroglial cells are extremely important in nourishing, maintaining, helping the metabolism of the neurons. I've always sort of likened it, and even this picture sort of shows this, the neuron is the star. The neuron is here in the middle. You can tell it's big and important. But all of these other cells you see around it here, neuroglial cells, they're all supporting that. And my analogy is you have a big singer like Mariah Carey. I imagine she's a diva. She probably is. She's going to have her entourage. The entourage are going to be neuroglial cells, all the cells that do stuff for the diva. That's my analogy. So let's look at neurons, and then we'll look at neuroglial cells, and then begin to wrap up here. A neuron, again, is a nerve signaling cell. It's communicating information from one place to one place. And the three main regions you see of the neuron are the dendrites, the cell body, see it's listed here, oh there it is, sorry, the cell body, and then the axon. So those are the three basic regions, and we'll look at some more detail in a second. The dendrites here, and notice how many of the dendrites that we have here. The dendrites are the receiving end of a neuron. That is, coming from this direction here will be the axon of another nerve cell, but the information is going to jump this gap, this synapse, and stimulate the dendrite. The dendrite is going to carry the information, and perhaps multiple dendrites are carrying information to the cell, and we'll talk about how that cell processes the information in a second. But the dendrite is receiving the information, and that term dendrite means little tree because it's highly branched. So the dendrite receives the information, and here at the axon hillock is kind of this triangular region here, is kind of the brain, if you will, of the neuron. Depending upon the signals that come in from the various dendrites, this axon hillock may actually be motivated, may be stimulated to fire and send a signal down the axon. So we'll talk about how that process called integration occurs a little bit more in class. While we're here though, let's mention the cell body. The cell body is this central area of the neuron, and it has the parts you would associate with a neuron, or with a cell rather. It's going to have a nucleus, it's going to have cytoplasm, it's going to have Golgi apparatus, and it really is responsible for making a lot of important products, most notably neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are going to be pumped and sent down the axon, and they're going to hang out at the very ends of the axon here, and you know what happens to them. They will be released and cross the synapse in the event of a nerve signal, just like we talked about in class with muscle contraction. Finally, the axon here, you see the axon is a single tail. It always reminds me sort of a kite. It's a single tail coming from the cell body, and notice here we have the impulse direction. This is usually true. There are a few exceptions to this, and we'll talk about them in class. But the signal, if the axon hillock says we're going to have a signal, travels down the axon, travels all the way down, gets to the very end of the axon, and if the signal is strong enough, we're going to release neurotransmitter across the gap and therefore activate the dendrite of the next neuron. And here we go, a real basic one. Activate the next neuron, and that's how we send the signal. I want to point out while we're here that we have these little white beads on the axon. These are called Schwann cells, and the gaps between them are called nodes of Ranvier. It is French, oui. And those gaps are significant as we talk about the propagation of a nerve impulse. Why do we have all this white Schwann cell stuff at all? This actually helps make up something called the myelin sheath, which is that all that white covering makes up the myelin sheath. And as we'll talk about in a second, its main job is to help speed up the transmission of nerve impulses. This is just showing you the unidirectionality. I'm not sure where I went. The unidirectionality of the signal. We have sensory neurons that carry, and I can't write anymore, I don't think. Sensory neurons carry information to the central nervous system. We have in the central nervous system here, in the spinal cord and the brain, we have what's called integration. We make sense of that, and then the information travels back out via motor neurons. But again, notice the unidirectionality. Sensory neurons carry information to the CNS. Motor neurons carry it from it. Remember, sensory neurons are referred to as afferent neurons, and motor neurons are referred to as efferent. Again, I'm not sure where I went. And finally here, I just want to mention neuroglial cells. Give them a little more attention, a little more press, because we'll spend most of our time talking about neurons as we go forward. Here are just some examples of the different kinds of neuroglial cells. Microglial cells that you see here, their function is to protect the central nervous system from disease. If you think about this, white blood cells don't get to travel all through the brain like other kinds of tissues, so we must have kind of the own immune system to help protect us from bacteria, from viruses that may get into the central nervous system. So microglial cells are kind of like white blood cells, but they're allowed to travel in the CNS, where white blood cells generally cannot. The oligodendrocytes, these produce the myelin sheaths, those white coverings that we associate with nerve impulse speeding. These occur in the central nervous system, where Schwann cells do the same thing in the peripheral nervous system. The ependymal cells are some neuroglial cells. They produce the cerebral spinal fluid that we associate with fluid that travels within our brain and around our spinal cord, and we'll look at the purposes of the central spinal fluid a little bit later. For now, you can think of it as a nourishing fluid and a protecting fluid. And then we have astrocytes here. Astrocytes are going to help form what's called the blood-brain barrier. As we'll get further and further into the central nervous system, and this will be clearer as we get further in, you'll realize that a lot of things cannot travel from the blood into the brain. We don't want all of the crap that's floating through your bloodstream to end up in your brain. That could include things like harmful mineral concentrations, or it could include pathogens. So notice how these cells are wrapped around the capillaries of inside the brain, so things can't leak out quite the same way. So astrocytes form that important barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is not a literal thing, as in like a big sheet of tissue. It's going to be the cells that surround the capillaries that prevent pathogens and other materials we do not want to enter the brain from coming in. Let me mention this while we're looking at our CT scan here on the side. We think about nerve cells and neurons being generally not mitotic, so you may wonder, how is it possible that we could have brain cancer, for example? How could you have out of control brain cells growing if the cells are not really mitotic? Well, as you see in this case, you might have heard the term astrocytoma. This is actually a cancer not of the neurons, but of the neuroglial cells, in this case the astrocytes, and you see that large tumor growing there. Finally, let me end with myelination and the purpose of myelination. You see what we have here is we have the axon, we have the end of a neuron, and kind of wrapping around it, kind of like a hot dog around a hot dog bun, rather, around a hot dog, we have the Schwann cell, and it grows all the way around, and eventually it encapsulates the part of the axon where this whole thing is the Schwann cell, and it's forming this myelin sheath. All of this covering, it's this kind of fatty covering that is going to insulate the axon, and it's going to allow the speed of the nerve signal to increase. As a little preview, what's going to happen, if you follow the cursor here, the impulse is going to go from here and it's going to kind of jump over to the next section and skip the part where it's insulated. So that's a really important feature of speeding nerve impulses, is to have myelination being associated with axons. If there is a disease that attacks the myelin sheath, then the nerve impulses slow down, and we'll look at that disease actually in class. So, an introduction to the basics of the neurons and how they work. We will talk really in class about how a nerve signal gets transmitted and how a nerve signal gets started. That does it for this video. Thank you very much.